I am beginning the recording of this webinar as well. So, okay, we can go ahead and get started. So thank you all for joining us for our Strong Coast webinar number 2. My name is Heather Hopkins, and I'm the Research Support Specialist here at Strong Coast. Thank you so much for joining in. And Strong Coast is a community engaged graduate training and research program on systems thinking to better manage complex and interconnected food, energy, and water systems in coastal areas. So we currently have an interdisciplinary cohort of 18 fellows and faculty mentors, actually more mentors than just the 18, at the University of South Florida and the University of the Virgin Islands. They are in the disciplines of environmental engineering, anthropology, and marine and environmental science. Just to go over a logistical note, again, you are here for the Strong Coast webinar, and we will introduce our speaker in one moment. If you have a question, feel free to use the Q&A. If you have access to the chat, you may use that as well. We will have time for questions and answers at the end. So now I'm going to hand it over to a USF fellow, Strong Coast fellow, Cassandra, who will be making introductions. It's all yours, Cassandra.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming to today's Strong Coast webinar with Dr. Cassandra Workman on understanding complex resource insecurity through interdisciplinary approaches. Dr. Workman is an assistant professor and biocultural medical anthropologist at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. She earned her PhD in applied anthropology and MPH in epidemiology from the University of South Florida. Go Bulls. Her main research interest is in examining the ways that humans are impacted biologically and socially by food insecurity, as well as water and sanitation insecurity. In 2018, Dr. Workman began conducting interdisciplinary research with engineers to explore the effects of food insecurity, water insecurity, and lack of adequate sanitation on human health and well-being in Tanzania. She has also worked to explore the risk and resilience of North Carolinians to environmental hazards, such as increased hurricane-related flooding due to a changing climate. Dr. Workman's central goal in both her research and professional experience in international development is to demonstrate the ability of anthropology in addressing pressing global issues. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Cassandra Workman.
Hello, everyone. Well, as that wonderful introduction mentioned, I am an alum. So hello to everyone at USF. It's really wonderful to have the opportunity to speak with everyone today. It's so great to see people from USF, especially, from our COVID offices, as the case may be. Should I go ahead and start sharing then?
Sure.
Okay, great. Okay, let me get my presentation going. As the introduction mentioned, thank you, Cassandra, the topic today is understanding complex resource insecurity, and I'm specifically speaking about water insecurity, food insecurity, and as we'll see, wash insecurity. I do work interdisciplinarily as many times as I can and in as many contexts as possible, so I will be introducing some current projects that I have. So for background, the FAO defines food security as having sufficient, safe, and nutritious food for dietary needs, but they've also extended this in an important way to also capture the fact that people have food preferences and that you need food also for an active and healthy lifestyle. So it's not just having enough food for your caloric needs, but actually to thrive. And similarly, social scientists have defined water insecurity. And this particular definition comes from a paper by Wendy Jepson et al., in which they discuss the relational approach to water insecurity. And what's important about this is that water insecurity is not necessarily just about water as H2O, but it's rather the social relations that engender access. Moreover, their definition I think really also builds on what we saw in the FAO definition by discussing human capabilities. And what this is it's not just having, again, enough water for today, but it's what water you have for the future and what your future holds, and in the ways in which you're able to thrive. So beyond these, really important definitional changes in our understanding of food and water insecurity, there have been notable additional social science contributions to WASH in general and into resource insecurities more specifically. And very importantly is that diseases are biocultural. And as Cassandra mentioned, I'm a medical anthropologist. I consider myself a biocultural anthropologist. And within medical anthropology, biocultural approaches mean that we recognize that human biology is shaped by the larger social context. So for example, frameworks include the political economy of health or critical medical anthropology, and I'll introduce momentarily syndemic theory. And the idea is just that disease is not just biological, but it's again shaped by the context. So because of this, there's also sequelae that are biological, social, and psycho-emotional. So water insecurity and other insecurities result in psycho-emotional stress. You can have conflict, and there's also ill health. Again, importantly, that water security and other securities are determined by social relations, including power, gender, and class. Anthropologists, myself included, are also interested in the lived experience of policy. So what this means is, are policies that are written and implemented, are they equitable? Are they engendering social difference in a way that's not intended? Which often happens is that many well-meaning policies actually result in increased social differentiation and inequity. I think it's really important that we note that development has been going on for decades and that we still look back to look forward. And I think anthropologists and other social scientists are very well suited to do this, given our expertise and interest in the lived experience of these initiatives, so that we see on the ground how these kinds of projects play out. Related, and this comes from my experience working in international development, is that I saw frequently that culture was treated as a barrier. It was something to overcome in approaches such as behavior change, communication, BCC. The idea was that traditional cultures are holding people back. And from an anthropological perspective, we know that that's incorrect. We know that cultures are not barriers, they're contexts. Everyone has cultures. And that we shouldn't work to necessarily overcome, but that any project necessarily has to work within and together with people. Not just as a top-down approach. And more recently, I've been really interested in what the meaning ascribed to technologies are. So for example, my recent work, which I'll talk about later, latrines. That's a technology. It's a simple technology. It might not be a wastewater treatment plant, but nonetheless, people ascribe meaning to it. And that meaning will influence how they interact with that technology and what kinds of risk is engendered in their environment because of it. So one framework that I'm a proponent of is syndemic theory, and this was coined by anthropologist Meryl Singer back in the 90s, and it's become quite popular in anthropology and public health and even medicine to some extent. And this approach really differs from an epidemiological approach in that, one, it recognizes the social conditions that are promoting disease, but also that what you tend to see is disease clusters. So because of larger, social inequalities or political economic inequalities, you'll see multiple and overlapping diseases occur within a population. Now, these diseases don't just occur in tandem. They're not just happenstance that they're all together, but rather they intersect in really important ways to enhance disease transmission, progression, or to create, to result in more severe health outcomes or negative health outcomes. I apply this framework to understanding food and water insecurity. Now, I'm clearly not suggesting that food insecurity or water insecurity is a disease process. But what I am arguing is that structural inequalities drive food and water insecurities. And together, they relate in important ways to result in biological disease interactions, such as malnutrition and enteropathogen exposure and chemical toxicant exposure and psycho-emotional and social stress. And for example, we see that if you have malnutrition and you also are exposed to an enteric pathogen, you tend to see increased morbidity and mortality. So that would be a perfect example. And a common occurrence is in children under 5 when we see children presenting to the hospital with malnutrition and diarrhea, and they tend to have very poor outcomes. So again, this is adapted from a very recent Singer article, and this is work that I have written up with several colleagues, and it's forthcoming in the American Journal of Tropical Medicine and Hygiene. My previous work on these topics started in Lesotho. Dr. Romero Daza and Dr. Hilma Green were my advisors when I was doing my PhD, and I went to Lesotho, and I was interested in the social effects of water insecurity, food insecurity, and HIV in Lesotho. I did receive a National Science Foundation DDIG, which is listed there, and I have written up several papers on it, and one's listed here, but I'll highlight some of the high points. So for background, many people might not be familiar with Lesotho. It's a country, it's a small country. There's only 2 million people, and it is located entirely within South Africa. It's an incredibly mountainous country, as you see in the picture. And I conducted my research in the area surrounding the capital, which is actually in the lowlands. So prior to my arrival, I knew that they were experiencing high rates of food insecurity. There had been about a decade-long drought. And the year that I arrived to do my research, there was torrential flooding. So hailstorms, people's gardens and crops were flooded. So they went from a protracted drought to a very sudden deluge in precipitation. And while I was there, I also saw the extent of this water insecurity. And these pictures I took, the one you see buckets lined up, and these are water fetching containers, they're jerry cans and buckets, and the tap would be turned on every few days. So women would wake up 4 a.m., line up their buckets at the tap in hopes that it would be turned on, and then everyone was allotted one bucket. And I put up another picture of there of some children's laundry. And so obviously not having water meant that people had to change their behaviors and their lifestyles and the chores they were able to do, and just the stress of that all, of having to worry about it. And importantly, I saw some connections to food, which I'll talk about in a moment, but there's one quote I'll pull up here, and it said that this one woman said she doesn't have enough paraffin to be wasting it on water. And what that meant was she needed to use her paraffin to cook food and couldn't use it to clean water. So you start to see the linkages where people, because of resource insecurity, are unable to either secure food or secure safe water. And so for some older participants in the study, we see that they had to walk far distances for water, which was obviously physically taxing, but it's also psycho-emotionally challenging to have to worry daily about where you would secure your water. So I had created a survey, a household survey, and I had used, at the time, the current understanding of water insecurity was based on 3 dimensions, and it was access, availability, and usage. And the idea was that water had to be there, so it had to be available. You had to have access to it, and then you had to have enough water for your daily needs. And so I created these variables and did find that they predicted higher scores on my outcome measure, which was the Hopkins Symptoms Checklist. I was using the HSCL 25. But what was I found, so I did find quantitatively that the water was very distressing for people. But if you asked people what their biggest stress was every day, they would say food. So indeed, 82% of the participants reported not having enough food, and I was using the HFIAS, that Household Food Insecurity Access Scale, and I found a high degree of food insecurity in terms of access. So people were unable to actually get food. So I did have respondents reporting going to bed hungry or changing their meal frequency or eating smaller meals. And I also saw a huge concern with variety. So people tended to rely on a very narrow range of staples, primarily cereals. And this was driven in large part because of 80% of the respondents having reported losing crops. As I mentioned, there had been a 10-year-long drought followed by rains, so people had no leafy greens. They were unable to grow the vegetables to supplement their cereals and their beans. And so you see here that food insecurity and water insecurity are really, really highly connected in this context. And as one participant, a woman from a village, pseudonymously named Bahari Tota, that you can't cook the food if you don't have the water. And so not only does water insecurity not allow you to grow food, you can't boil your water for safety, you can't cook your food, and so you can't clean your food. So there are a lot of ways in which these two securities drive one another. In terms of the quantitative findings, as I mentioned, I had used the HSCL25, which is actually combined, it's one scale that's, it's two subscales combined. So you have the total, the Hopkins total, the anxiety and depression scores totaled, but there's also a depression and anxiety subscales. But interestingly, I found that some of the variables predicted the different subscales differently. So the water usage actually predicted depression. So people who did not have enough water for their daily needs tended to score higher on the screening. It's a screener tool, it's not diagnostic. Then we see that access would predict the Hopkins total score, but then water safety actually predicted all of them, so higher scores on all of them. And so the perception of safety, which was people believing whether or not their drinking water was safe, actually explained additional variance in all the models. So it tended to have the best predictive capacity in terms of the psycho-emotional outcome. So what I found was that vulnerable households were unable to respond to shocks. So within this syndemic context, so for example, women, I spoke with a lot of grandmothers who were caring for orphan and vulnerable children due to the HIV/AIDS epidemic. So you would see them say, well, I either have I either have money to pay for food or school. So there was a great deal of shock due to the HIV/AIDS epidemic, with a huge segment of the population succumbing to AIDS. And we saw a high number of orphans and vulnerable children. At the same time, we saw water insecurity driving food insecurity through the failing of crops, not having enough water, or paraffin, for example, to boil your water. As I mentioned, these are all driving depression and anxiety scores. Importantly, I think obviously since I tend to consider myself a water researcher, what I think is important about this is that water was able to explain additional variance. Even though food is such a core concern, water nonetheless was important in these models, and to me suggests an interaction within them. And I have since been a co-author on a paper where we do find actual true statistical interaction for food insecurity, water insecurity, and HIV/AIDS in Kenya. And that the title of that paper, the lead author of that paper is Boateng et al. And I could share that citation if anyone's interested. But again, we start to see the importance of perceived cleanliness. So the stress of water, just having to worry every day whether or not your water was safe, and then knowing that you don't have enough paraffin, for example, to boil it. And as one respondent said, there's a lot of time spent thinking about water. So I'm going to discuss two of my current projects that are actively ongoing now. I do have preliminary work being done in North Carolina, which I'll discuss at the end, but now I'll focus on two projects that I actually currently have. So for background, I worked in international development. I am an applied anthropologist, so I graduated from USF in 2013, and I lived and worked in Tanzania from 2013 until 2018 or 19. Point being, I was in Tanzania for many years. I was working on food and water insecurity projects as a monitoring and evaluation specialist. And while I was there, I was put in contact with Sarah Young, who's a professor at Northwestern, and she and her team were validating a household water insecurity experiences scale. So it was a scale that was statistically assessing the degree to which a household was experiencing water insecurity. So what they were doing was implementing a battery as part of the validation process in a number of countries, and Morogoro, Tanzania was one of them. Or it's a city in a country, but Tanzania was one country, but there was two sites. And so I was what was known as a site PI in one of the sites in Morogoro. So what we did was we administered, at the time it was about 30 items, and it's been since reduced to 12. The water insecurity scale, we administered a food insecurity scale, several questions about socioeconomic status and perceived stress. And in addition, I conducted qualitative interviews, and I created a sanitation and security scale that was adapted from the WHO. So this was conducted between the months of March and May in 2018, and this was at the end of the rainy season in Tanzania. It was administered to 300 households. Although there are over 8,000 households in total within the database that was collected by HWISE. And again, it was implemented in 28 sites in 23 countries. So several scholars within this consortium, it was originally a grant funded to Northwestern, to Dr. Young through Amana. And since then, several faculty have applied for funding through NSF. And so now it's become what's known as a research coordination network. And several of us have analyzed some of the data that's available in this large data set. And you'll see here in a publication that came out last year that household water insecurity is strongly associated with food insecurity from 27 sites. So it's a pretty global approach and pretty global data set to demonstrate the high degree of these linkages. And in this paper, we also discuss not just psycho-emotional outcomes, but we start to lay out some of the pathways that are biological as well. As I mentioned, I'm also interested in wash insecurity. And I began this talk today with two definitions of food and water insecurity, which are very well accepted and they're very thorough, and you read them and you have a real good understanding of what food and water insecurity are. But if I say to you, wash insecurity, what comes to mind? Well, it's obviously, you have to separate human waste from human activities. That's a large part of wash. You have to have water for hygiene. And so that's part of it, but that's not all of it, as it turns out. Studies have shown that sanitation insecurity, lack of adequate sanitation, is stressful. So there's studies that show that sanitation insecurity, much like food and water insecurity, drives psycho-emotional distress. And it also drives myriad health outcomes. So this particular picture was taken in Morogoro, Tanzania, and it's a household latrine. It's a pit latrine. And it might not look like much, but you'll see that there's some greens. Now those look like weeds, but it's actually not. And if I didn't include it well enough in the picture, but the house next door has some crops. There's some corn maize growing in this man's yard. So in the event of a flood, and you see that the latrine's a little higher, which would hopefully prevent flooding, but if it were to flood, the human waste would then go down into the street and perhaps onto foodstuffs. So how does food intersect again with WASH insecurity? Some scholars have argued the A in WASH should stand for animals, which I'll talk about, and others have said air. But we'll start to see that WASH insecurity is more complicated than simply having an adequate latrine and water for hygiene. So when I conducted my research in Morogoro, I had respondents talk about vectors. So they mentioned flies quite a bit, which again speaks to a broader definition of WASH that necessarily might entail solid waste. So when we were in Morogoro, at the end of the rainy season, as I mentioned, a lot of the streets were flooding. So there was standing water in the streets. There was a lot of solid waste in the streets. So there were men who had to muck out the debris in order for the water to continue to travel down the street. So, you know, your environmental risk includes more than just your latrine. And any danger associated with it. And participants also rightfully so pointed out structural barriers and economic precarity. And so people might not have money to pay for soap or have the right materials to adequately clean perhaps the superstructure of their latrine or their compound, which can result in quite a bit of stigmatization or stress and social stress. And water insecurity, obviously. So if people don't have enough water to clean or for hand hygiene, that can create ambient risk within your environment. And we also saw this in clinical trials. So interestingly, scholars conducted clinical trials that had water sanitation hygiene interventions as well as nutritional supplementation. So they did recognize the linkage between food and water insecurity. But what was shocking is that they found little impact on linear growth and diarrhea and from the WASH part, but they did find impact from the nutritional supplementation. And this suggests that the pathways are complex, one, and two, that nutrition is incredibly important to outcomes such as growth and diarrhea. Believe it or not, diarrhea, you would think, oh, just, you need water for hand hygiene, but it turns out it's more complicated than that. And so, anyone in the WASH world was left wondering, well, how can we better link food and water to reduce outcomes such as stunting and diarrhea, among others? So just this past spring, as it turned out, as we were going into the pandemic, a colleague of mine and I were awarded an NSF grant to conduct research in Tanzania, and we were unable to travel, obviously, over the summer. So this is a grant that is funded again by the NSF, and it was submitted to the social and behavioral group there. So it is an anthropological study. The co-PI is Angela Harris from NC State. She is in the Civil Construction and Environmental Engineering Department. And we are also collaborating with colleagues at Sokoine University of Agriculture, which is in Morogoro. And I'm working there closely with a social scientist who I collaborated with on my previous study in 2018. And we are also going to work with veterinary sciences this time. So what we are looking at is we're trying to establish syndemicity of food, water, and WASH insecurity. So some of our outcomes are going to be psycho-emotional, some will be biological. So we'll look at disease, diarrheal incidence and prevalence. And we are also looking at the roles that zoonoses might play. So anthropologically, if you think about animals, we know that they're more than just food. So obviously animals do provide a source of protein, but we know that animals are also important for wealth. They're important for social status. And political economically, sometimes people have animals to sell, but they might not have the means to effectively vaccinate or pen their animals. So Dr. Harris from State is going to be looking at, we're going to do some source water testing to look at E. coli, but we're also going to look at soil samples and water samples to see what animals have been contaminating it, whether or not it's cows or chickens, because the different animals will present different risks to humans. So we have a call this week with our colleagues in Tanzania to discuss how we can get this project going without our being able to travel there for the foreseeable future. So I'm excited about this project to begin. And I have another ongoing project. This one is about the gender dynamics of household fecal sludge management in Ghana. And the PI for this is Dr. De Los Reyes, who is an engineer at North Carolina State. He's the head of the Global WASH Cluster. And he and colleagues developed a technology called an excluder. So what it is when you vacuum suck out fecal sludge from a pit, that it will push away the solid waste so that it doesn't clog the pump, or doesn't get stuck in the tubing that you see there. So I, as a social scientist and gender specialist, am going to go and investigate the gender decision-making around fecal sludge management within the household. So who decides when and why to empty a pit? What are some barriers to effective pit management and emptying? How can women be better represented in the sanitation sector? So many of the pit emptying services available in Ghana are owned by men. And so how can we then encourage women to participate more fully in the sanitation sector? And again, in STEM more broadly, as the ripples out. So we are going to implement household surveys that will be conducted starting next month. I had also hoped to travel back to Ghana to conduct these myself, but am unable to. So we are working closely with IDE Ghana and specifically a NGO called Sama Sama, and they design toilets and pit emptying. They have a little tanker, and so we're trying to see how we can incorporate the excluder technology into their existing system. So I didn't mention at length the work I'm doing in North Carolina because we are trying to get it started. I had conducted some preliminary research following a hurricane 2 years ago. Much like you, we are a coastal state and do experience the effects of hurricanes. And so this is something that I'm looking forward to in the future because I think scholars don't yet understand in the same way that they do in other parts of the world what water insecurity, food insecurity, and wash insecurity looks like here in the US. And obviously, people here might not have subsistence farming and might not have gardens in their backyard that provide the majority of their nutritional needs, but none the yet we do see huge inequities here in the US in water insecurity and food insecurity and wash insecurity. But how those will manifest are going to look probably different here, but there will still be some parallels. So, you know, in thinking about future directions for all of this, in terms of resource insecurity and wash insecurity, I think we need to learn more from our previous experiences and learn more from development. And development has been going on for decades, but I think there's this perception that it's something that's done over there in this other place and doesn't apply to us here. And I think that that's incorrect. And again, this is all very new and exciting in the world of water insecurity, that a lot of us who have worked outside of the US can bring the lessons from other contexts here and to see what we can inform, you know, more equitable services here. This necessarily entails forging transdisciplinary collaborations. And I use the word transdisciplinary instead of interdisciplinary because I feel like studies and areas, fields such as water insecurity really do not, they're not studied by just one discipline. And topically, they require input from many, many disciplines. So in the water insecurity research that I do, we're informed by geography and public health and engineering. And so in order to address these problems, we have to rely on this collaboration. Importantly, I think social scientists have brought to the fore this idea that design of technology has to be co-created and co-designed in a truly participatory way. Obviously, participatory development has been a buzzword since the 90s, and it's by and large been depoliticized. But I think there can be a repoliticization of these ideas and ways to do it more meaningfully. I think we can better assess the technology, human, and environmental interface. And what I mean by this is sometimes when you try to solve one problem, you create other problems. Or you change one thing and there's ripple effects. So I think we can better understand the risk environment and what technologies are appropriate to address it. And I think this is a really exciting area. And I bring these ideas from epidemiology, where anthropologists have been working for decades to say, you know, the epidemiological triad is a little bit more complicated than we think, and there are social relations and power dynamics at play that are very important to capture. I also think it will be important that we better address complex resource insecurities together. So again, that not only do we think about water insecurity, but that by and large it co-occurs with food insecurity, and housing insecurity is huge. And this is, you know, globally going to, I think, be a new area that is going to emerge as an important area for investigation, both in the global South and in the global North. And I think what we have to do at the end is foster increasing flexibility in our approaches, because we see such social and ecological inequities and inequalities, and they're necessarily going to drive our response. And I think I'm using, you know, for example, climate change, and in the US we see the Black Lives Matters movement, and these are important co-occurring events that will shape how we are able to respond to something like WASH, because we will have to take into consideration, you know, the economic and health disparities driven by COVID and other large-scale stressors that will impact everything. So with that, I've included some references for further reading in any of the citations that I've mentioned in previous slides. And that concludes my talk.
Thank you so much. That was very insightful. We really appreciate it. So, excuse me, we have about almost 20 minutes for some questions. Again, I will be fielding the questions in the Q&A, or if you have access to the chat. For our fellows, I will be asking you to unmute and ask your own questions. So why don't we start with Tasha? I think you said you were having some issues with your live feed. So I'm not sure if you're able to, you can send me a message if you want me to ask your question.
Yeah, Heather, I can unmute. Unfortunately, with Zoom, it does not like me starting up my video. It kind of pauses me and then I get kicked off, that type of deal. It's been bothering me today. But anyways, yeah, so thank you, Dr. Workman. I really appreciate the presentation. I had a question. In your study in Lesotho, did you note any differences in your results of the depression and anxiety screens based off of gender or age?
Yes, I did. Age did not significantly correlate that I recall. Gender did, but then it wasn't statistically significant in the models.
And just like a further question on that, did it seem to, in terms of when you're talking about, I believe you said gender, did that seem to be more depression or anxiety, or was it more food-based or water-based insecurity that you, if you can recall? I know I'm having you pull up from before, but.
No problem. I do not recall that. I do know that there is a lot of work done on the gender and resource insecurity, and I know that in the paper that I cited of myself, I talk about it because I would have talked about the correlations there. And then also Amber Wutich does a lot of work, and she has a, I think, 2009 paper that looks at the gender difference of water insecurity. So if you would like any additional references, just shoot me an email and I could get them for you.
Okay, thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you so much. And so
I have a quick
okay.
question.
Yes, go ahead.
So you talked about how they use paraffin. Can you explain what exactly paraffin is? Because I'm only familiar with paraffin wax, and I know you said they use it to cook and to clean their water. So what exactly is paraffin?
Okay, yes, I was I was not clear enough. So it is, you buy paraffin, and it's a lot like kerosene. So it's used to heat food, but I didn't mean to clean water, like to put it in the water. I'm sorry, I should have been more clear. I meant to boil water, so that it was either used to cook food or used to boil water. And so I found that many people did not choose to boil water because it's such a scarce resource.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you so much.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you for your wonderful talk. My name is Allison, and I'm a UVI Strong Coast Fellow. I just had a quick question for you. So at the end, you mentioned some of your future work and incorporating more of the human environmental interface, as well as flexibility and different technologies. But just thinking to different articles and what we've learned so far, with severe water scarcity as a global problem, what does that mean for places like the ones you have worked at where the water's only turned on every few days? I mean, what does that global extreme scarcity going to do to those locations, and what does that mean for like your future work and implications?
Okay, that's a really good question. So in Lesotho, I did find much higher degrees of water insecurity in terms of quantity. So I think it's really important to note that water insecurity is multidimensional. So what that means is that again, I mentioned when I did my dissertation research, I had 3 dimensions, but now we recognize many more. So you can have scarcity. So that itself is, you just don't have enough water. And I saw that in places like Lesotho. But in places like Tanzania, you can have enough water, but the water can either be unclean. You have flooding. People in Morogoro had a high degree of intermittency. So that meant the water was turned on and off, which again creates biological risk. And I'm currently working on a paper, it's under review, about this very idea that sometimes even if you have quote unquote, secure water, that you might have sources that are improved, you might have a sufficient quantity, that there's still nonetheless other stresses that are involved. And so I think that that's going to be something that several, scholars start working on, is looking at the nuance now, so that you can look at scarcity, but people can experience water insecurity in all of these other ways. And especially like in the US, right? Like you just assume we don't have water insecurity, but we do. And so it's so much more complicated than this, like have not. So that's a really good question. And in terms of future research, I think that that's going to be what people are going to start teasing out, is kind of what are the myriad dimensions within water insecurity and how do those predict the outcomes?
Thank you.
Sure.
I had a question. Thanks for that great talk, Cassandra. The question was like, in the literature now, people are talking about food apartheid as it relates to communities in the US. Is that terminology being used in development work where you've worked? Because a lot of it is quite structural, right? It's a lot of aid work and government work and the way in which things have been like just systemic issues. And so is that a term that is that maybe we should be thinking of instead of sort of food insecurity?
That's an excellent question. So I have not seen food apartheid, but as you say it, it makes perfect sense. I am familiar with the concept of food deserts, which is, again, not as purposeful, but it almost seems passive, right? So it's like, whoops, people don't have food here. Whereas I understand what you're saying is that it is more of a purposeful, machination to ensure insufficient access. And I have heard it in relation to water, and former South African President Thabo Mbeki actually referred to global water apartheid. And I believe he was taken to task for it, actually. But your point stands. And so one of the papers I've referenced is by Wendy Jepson and colleagues, where she discusses a relational approach. And in this, it's that instead of thinking of water like as a chemical compound and something that you have to secure, what we should be focusing on more are the social relations that engender that. So so it's a process. So water insecurity doesn't become a thing. Like, it's not like you have water insecurity, you don't. It's the process associated with it. So who is enabling access? And she pulls largely on work done by Sen, and so the idea of entitlements, that you can have, for example, famine even when you have sufficient food, because you don't have entitlement to food. Like, it's there, but you can't get it. And that's, was built on later in the capabilities approach, which is really similar, that what are the processes that lead to not having this access? So I do think that the forward thinking is going to look more, and this isn't new thinking, I mean, it comes from like political ecology and people who talk about the hydrosocial cycle, the idea that it's so intertwined with power. But I do think that moving forward, that is going to be what we talk about, and particularly in relation to water, just because of how racialized and class based water rights are in the US. Like, I think it's just so evident that there are these historical structures that are perpetuating it. And then I can think of no more perfect example than Flint, right? Where it was, everyone saw it coming, but it still happened. Did that answer your question at all?
Yeah,
Okay.
so I only learned the food apartheid term recently. It's a colleague out of San Francisco State with an organization also called the Social Innovation Collaborative Lab. And so I thought it was pretty neat.
Yeah, yeah.
More applicable, or better term than food desert, at least. So
yes, exactly.
I have a question. My name is Lyndon Cheek. I'm with the Civil and Environmental Engineering Department at USF. I actually also served in the Peace Corps for a bit before the world shut down. I was stationed in Vanuatu, and I was actually, which is in the South Pacific, chain islands. And I was stationed like on a tiny offshore island that was just like coral, and it didn't have any fresh water. So there was like water insecurity there. There was actually a desalination machine that had recently been installed, but that's all a little bit beside the point. I noticed there, I was working as a WASH volunteer. There was a really interesting thing that happened where people were improving their their sanitation infrastructure. A lot of people were actually putting in pour flush toilets at their houses. But as I mentioned, there was not great sources of fresh water. There was like a few like bore drill like, holes in the ground that water came up out of. Yeah. But a lot of those were far away from people's toilets, and it was hard to walk and lug water to pour into their toilet to flush every time. So I noticed both the people who weren't actually flushing their toilets when they would use it, which was like a big, worse than the pit latrines they used, or they were just using their old pit latrine, even though they had this toilet, but it was still like a social status kind of thing. And then also really heavily promoted by the government that pour flush was better. I was just curious, have you, in your research, have you noticed interactions like that, kind of this idea of appropriate technology for this specific situation?
Yes, absolutely. So I have seen the same thing. And that is interesting that you brought that up. One, I have an anthropologist who I'm friends with, and she did her research in Vanuatu. So I am familiar with it. And she published quite a bit on food security about it. But I also know that they are worried about it flooding permanently. So talk about the effects of climate change in the future. But so yes, which I found fascinating, which I never really thought about human waste as much as I have in the last couple of years. And I never had to think, and I remember very clearly, I was wrapping Christmas presents and I was on the phone with a colleague at State, and we were talking about the consistency of fecal sludge while I was wrapping Christmas presents, and just like how anthropogenic fecal waste is. And what I mean is that those activities will necessarily shape the consistency of the waste. So do you have enough water to pour it down? How many people are in your household? What age are the people in the household? So is there adult waste or human or child waste? And because sometimes children will just, defecate openly in a way that adults don't. And so it poses a problem for the tanker trucks. When the fecal sludge is so dense, they can't actually suck the waste out. So having enough water for a poor flush toilet is incredibly important, and absolutely speaks to your point about needing appropriate technology, because you have to take into consideration the available resources in determining what the best technology is at any given location. And I think there is this idea, that flush toilets for all is kind of this gold standard, that we have to engineer these really advanced technologies. And on the one hand, I see that absolutely, like, everyone deserves a nice toilet, right? If they want it, sure, that should be the bare minimum. But maybe that technology is not the best everywhere. And so maybe we do have to, and obviously I'm speaking to engineers, so this is your area, that you have to take the resources available into consideration when designing the technology. So yeah, absolutely. And also latrines are used for extra sanitary waste quite a bit. So you see people use it as like a trash midden. And so again, if there's not solid waste removal and people are disposing of household trash, then that makes it very difficult to vacuum. Mm-hmm.
Hi, this is Lindsay. I have another question kind of about toilets. Did you see many like composting toilets or any kind of alternate solutions like that?
So none that are functioning. I did see them. In Ghana, there were several NGOs, not several, maybe one. I saw a few examples. I can't speak to which NGO specifically built it. Those would be in my notes. But they did do a urine diversion system, but then it was highly subsidized, during the program, during the project. But then when the project left, people were unable or unwilling to support the payment associated with the technology maintenance. And so it was abandoned. And I think, having worked in development as long as I did, that's kind of an ongoing thing, is that we all talk about sustainability, but it's just not there yet. And so no, not to answer your question, no, I've never seen a composting toilet, but some other technologies I have seen, but I have not seen them functioning.
Okay. What I know about them is they work better for like small scale, like kind of rural places. So it just seems like that could be a solution, right, in some of these locations.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and in Morogoro, where I work, it's peri-urban. So the problem is there's just not enough space for to allow for composting, because you can't, like, people just tend to close it up, shift, build over it, or suck it out as fast as possible. But absolutely.
Right. Thank you.
Hello, how are you?
Hello.
My name is Erica Dassi, and I'm a Strong Post Fellow at USF. And thank you again for your presentation. It was very interesting. My question is that once you uncover the results from your interviews and your surveys, for example, with the work that you did in Ghana with the sludge disposal and looking at the gender roles. What are some ways that you can, once you have that information, what are some ways that you can help in encouraging the change that you mentioned, especially if the culture or the ideas have been a particular way for some time, if that makes sense?
Yeah, that is the best question, and I feel like all my old professors should be watching me answer this, because that's kind of the ultimate question for any applied anthropologist, right? So the work in Ghana is ongoing, so we have yet to make recommendations, but we are working with NGOs and development companies. So IDE Ghana, or it's IDE, but IDE Ghana it's the branch in Ghana, to work with those who are actually implementing projects. I had actually planned to go to Ghana in May, and I was going to meet with folks who work in development. So for example, World Vision had a number of programs there, USAID, to meet with development people in order to share your findings. But I do think that there is one area for future work that's needed is a better collaboration between academics and practitioners. And I know that if you, as many of you are in the applied program, you've probably heard this as well, but a lot of findings that practitioners have from their projects don't get published in places that we would have access to or read them, and vice versa, that often we publish in journals that practitioners wouldn't read. And anthropologists, we are all famous for our jargon, right? So how can we make our research more acceptable, or accessible rather, to people who are practitioners? So my work in Ghana, as I mentioned, is still fairly new. We are only at the data collection stage, but we do intend to meet with development folks in Accra, as well as to continue our collaboration with development practitioners and those in the private sector as well. So not just NGOs, but for-profit companies.
Thank you. I'm interested to see how that works. It's with working with the practitioners and bringing those things to light, hopefully.
Hopefully, yeah. Yeah, I mean, from my personal experience working in international development, there still is a huge divide between the researchers and the doers. That a lot of research is seen as unnecessary, or as, you know, that we indulge in research for kind of our own self-serving purposes. That a lot of research can be applied. It just need to make the claim for it.
And establish the trust.
Absolutely, absolutely. And that is very key, very key.
Thank you so much.
Well, I guess I'll jump in. I was trying to wait around and make sure you got lots of other folks' questions, but thank you so much, Cassie, for a really great talk. And I think all of your data collection and also your new projects that are in development are really interesting and really compelling examples of what you can create when you combine that sort of transdisciplinary approach that you've talked about. And it's a really good fit with a lot of interests. I know that some our fellows and other folks who are on the call have. So thanks for sharing those. One question I have for you is, I was wondering if you would be willing to share a little bit more about what it was like to work in development and then come into academia. And if you just have, you had some really great and very helpful observations at the end of your talk about kind of future directions, not just for your own work, but for example, anthropologists and engineers collaborating around WASH and some things to consider. And I was just curious if you had things specifically related to that experience, because I think in many ways your experience is somewhat unique. I mean, I think there are probably more examples of people being in academia and then going into development work, and vice versa. I don't, but that may be something you could comment on a little bit.
Sure. So I had initially, gone into development, I think, from a pretty critical anthropological standpoint, you know, thinking that we are taught how bad development is. And so I initially did an internship at USAID in Mozambique, and I was brought on as a gender specialist. And I remember going in just thinking, oh, this is going, like, I'm just gonna use this as like fodder for my dissertation almost. And I didn't, because I found incredible people. I made lifelong friends, and I know that that doesn't have to do necessarily with my research, but in a lot of ways it informed my entire viewpoint of development. That, you know, we tend to think of development as this like homogenous lump of like neocolonialists, right? But it's not. And there are people with varied backgrounds and varied experiences, and they are all committed to doing the best job that they can, but it's like driving a huge boat. So like the changes are just so incremental. But, you know, again, I think being an applied anthropologist, my idea was always change from within. And so I went in thinking that, you know, there does need to be this anthropological perspective within development, that the idea of like culture is important on its own terms and not something that you necessarily have to change. And that was very frustrating. So there were things within development that are frustrating. And I think the biggest frustration is that I did something called monitoring and evaluation. So because I'm trained in both quantitative and qualitative methods, I was brought on to determine whether like the data that were being collected on the project were the right kinds of data to you know, decide if the project was doing what it was supposed to do. And then by the end of I was consulting, I just kept getting pulled in on projects at the end. So it was almost like the social scientists were brought in to like fix the problem. And so that really spoke to me that there needs to be better collaboration and from the beginning, so that when you start a project, you have to have a better understanding of data for data's sake. And so that's when I think that there needs to be more collaboration between practitioners and researchers. And it's not. So in my personal experience, it can be quite contentious because researchers are seen as existing in the ivory tower. And so a lot of development practitioners don't want to bring them in because in their minds, they're like, all you're doing is criticizing. You come to criticize, and you've never done this. You've never lived in a country, you know, for years and in resource poor, you know, environments. And so there's this idea sometimes that researchers are self-indulgent, as I mentioned, that we are just doing research to further our own careers. And so, which is not without, you know, that's not entirely wrong sometimes. So, you know, that's what I hope to do. And a lot of people in the water development world are starting to work with development practitioners. So for example, the HWISE scale is being implemented by Gallup. And that's all, you know, Sarah Young's work at Northwestern and really like advocating for the role of social science. But I did, when I left development, see that I was headhunted for several jobs when I first started back in academia because they really want qualitative researchers. They want this. They want people who understand the importance of varied stakeholders. There's a lot of buzzwords, you know, monitoring, evaluation, and learning, but the idea that there has to be feedback loops within projects. And who's better to do that than to go talk to people but an anthropologist? And so I think anthropologists are increasingly in demand because development has finally caught up to that. But, you know, again, sometimes buzzwords come from academia that then are appropriated, such as participatory development, which is really like, in essence, this really great idea, but then it's been so watered down. So, you know, I think more work needs to still be done.
Thank you. And as you said, with the participatory approaches, it has been relatively widely implemented, but in not necessarily its most complete or legitimate form.
Yeah,
constitutes participatory varies widely, you know, as I'm sure you've seen.
Exactly. And then like, how do you measure that? And I think a lot of this boils down to measurement, that we don't know how to measure this yet effectively.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you so much. So do you mind taking at least two more questions from some of our fellows?
Sure.
You still have time, because we are a little over 3, but Addie, I think you were waiting, and then Chris Ann, you had one as well. So let's start with Addie.
Okay, yeah, thank you for your presentation. I had a question more in regards to like the current situation and stuff with how, you were supposed to be overseas and like doing this work yourself and on the ground, where you can like take in more. And now you've had to switch to doing it remotely. Is there anything like any advice that you'd give? So like my project right now, I also am doing remotely. And so when you're doing like these qualitative or quantitative surveys, either one, we had to like really think about how to train our individuals over there. So we knew the data we were getting back is good. And so some of the questionnaires I got back this week, like it was interesting just to see some of those results and how we could improve off of that. And so just from your perspective, if there's anything.
That's an excellent question, which I've given so much thought to lately. Again, like you said, I am quantitatively trained. I have a master's in public health, so I am comfortable doing quantitative assessments, but I love doing interviews. And I still like to sit and hear people speak. And like you said, you absorb when you're there just so much. And how do you give that up? But yeah, so at least in Tanzania, the team I worked with before, but the team in Ghana, I have not. So we are actually doing a virtual training, like you said. And I think I'm just going to have to pilot, more extensively than before to try to catch any of these data quality issues. But that never is not a problem. So even when I've been in places doing research, something always comes up. And so I guess to me, this is just a more extreme form of the flexibility that's needed as a field researcher, because something always happens, no matter what. But yeah, I mean, I don't have any sage advice because I'm also in the middle of it. And what I did in Ghana was I switched qualitative, pretty open-ended interview to a household survey. And I've just tried to quantify it as much as possible. And I don't think those data will be as rich, but that's all I could do right now. Yeah, so good luck.
Yeah, no, it's just, yeah, it's interesting seeing how everybody's kind of adjusting their studies. And I know we, as like Strong Coast, we had some grants that we had also put in for that we're hoping to do in the field. And so I think some of us have kind of started that discussion like, oh, how can you move forward with this?
I know.
Not doing what you originally thought.
Yeah, and for my co-PI, Dr. Harris at State, we can't bring the assays over. Like we can't bring any of the tests. So like, how are we supposed to do like soil sampling and water sampling and, because we were going to bring so many supplies with us. So that, yeah, TBD, I guess.
Thank you so much, Christine.
Yeah, so hi, Dr. Workman. Again, thank you for such an amazing presentation. It was awesome to hear all of the knowledge you had to share. So my question is like 4 different questions in one. So for the sake of time, I'll only ask one. So I'm an applied anthropologist, and I'm currently working on an interdisciplinary project. So I love getting the opportunity to hear from another applied anthropologist who's doing this in the field, kind of how that work can occur. But one of the things I was wondering is because we're often encouraged to do interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary research, but we're never really told any advice or best practices as I guess, how to make us better interdisciplinary practitioners. So I was just wondering if you would mind sharing any of your advice, best practices, techniques that you use, just any advice that you would give us as kind of young researchers to ensure that as we go forward, we're becoming better interdisciplinary practitioners.
Okay, it's an excellent question. And I actually have a paper under review with another applied anthropologist and several engineers about exactly this, but it's not been accepted yet. Otherwise I would share it. But, maybe in a couple months. But I think my experience, at least working with the engineers at State, one of the key things is vocab. We have very similar concepts sometimes, but we speak very differently. So for example, like engineers will call something a perturbation, but we call it a stressor, but we mean very similar things. So I think that you also have to kind of establish similar vocab together, to be able to speak together and not past each other. And sometimes that you have to admit you don't know what they mean, and you have to be willing to ask questions, and this is going to take time. I do know that with some of the meetings at state, I think our emphasis on the community as driving the project versus being what is known in engineering as a test bed can sometimes be a little bit contentious, because sometimes it almost seems like we start at two different endpoints. Like engineers start with the technology and we start with the people. And so like, how are you supposed to like fit this and meet in the middle? And so I think just recognizing that we have these different processes and different ideas, you know, basically different epistemologies when it comes down to it, but that they're not incommensurate, you know, that we still can find ways to better meet each other's needs, right? Because they have to. I mean, if your whole discipline is about making an appropriate technology, then that's what's going to guide your vision. And so for us, it's like, you know, working with people guides our vision. So I don't think that those are mutually exclusive, but it can be difficult to get people on the same page. And yeah, I mean, it's been fascinating, and it's been a steep learning curve, but very rewarding, I think, also. But yeah, I think, you know, in the paper, as I mentioned, we lay out some of the steps. And actually one of the reviewers was an engineer, and he asked for a schematic. So like how to do this in a figure. So we'll try to get that done. But yeah, I mean, I think learning that culture, like what we mean by culture, you know, the importance of collaboration, but yeah, I'm trying to think what else were some of our key points. I think just learning to listen to one another, avoid jargon. That's a big one. Anthropologists, we tend to, I mean, it's even challenging for me to find papers for undergrads to read in my own discipline. So I can only imagine somebody from outside our discipline just being frustrated by the kind of writing that we produce. So I don't know if that answered your question in terms of some practical stuff.
No, that definitely answered it. No, that was great, because I know that in like the current project, and I can speak for myself, but if Michelle wants to hop in, she is my co-partner on it. It's been one of those like fun things to kind of figure out, okay, so both of us are saying the same thing, but how do we explain it to each other? And I'm sure she's probably gotten frustrated with me at times, because like, I mean, we're anthropologists, we tend to be very wordy and descriptive and like very qualitative and like very community focused. So no, I think those really highlight very good techniques and advice. So thank you.
Yeah, and I do think that we have different ideas of what precision entails. So like from like you can be like technologically precise, and so like the technologies do these very specific things, but in anthropology I think we're precise in different ways. So when we talk about what we mean by a concept, we tend to be very precise, and I think that is not a bad thing, that we come to like shared agreements about what we mean when we say something like wash insecurity. And I remember, and I think Maya was at this meeting, and it was with a bunch of engineers and anthropologists, and I asked, well, what do you mean by wash insecurity? And people almost started throwing tomatoes at me, because this is like this concept where everyone says it, but what do we really mean? And so I think that like as we move forward, the more precise we are in our understandings, the better we'll be able to work together.
That makes sense. Thank you.
So just to jump in a little, I know this is something that Maya and I have talked a lot about, some of the things you mentioned, in particular, the idea of shared vocabulary and shared concepts. I think that's really a primary one. I would definitely agree with that. But one of the other things you mentioned is time. And I think for me, in the work that I've done that's been interdisciplinary, both with engineers, but also ecologists and other geographers, the time required to actually build personal relationships with your collaborators seems to be one of the most fundamental things to having a successful partnership. Yeah, right. And it's not necessarily that intuitive, and it's not really how university reward systems or grant funding cycles tend to push people into, you know, building those kind of long-term collaborations. And you, it seems like you've had that experience a little bit with the HWISE, RCN, and, you know, some of the other connections that you've made in your research network. And I think those are also good examples of, you know, creating collaborations with groups of people that you can kind of leverage your own work into a broader scale, as far as policy impact or at the local level. And so I think those are some real concrete examples of the kinds of steps fellows and our students can take. You know, while you're a student, and then you know, after you you graduate, because you will graduate. I think, you know, one of the other things that is a continual challenge for me, and we just, Maya and I and a bunch of other people were talking about a grant proposal yesterday. And one of the things that's really tough is to match up scale with social science data and ecological or engineering data sets. And it's sort of an ongoing challenge, but to me, that's a huge challenge that we haven't quite wrapped our heads around how to do really efficiently, or it needs to be kind of further developed. So
I agree.
You'll be ready to do that and push that in new directions, I think.
Well, good luck. Yeah, I agree completely. And even what we mean by data, like that, like how data could be crunched, you know, so like to qualitative researchers, we don't collect qualitative data just to ultimately quantify it. I mean, you can, but there's also qualitative data that stands on its own. But for people who think in terms of systems, sometimes that's really hard to like then plug into the, like, how do you plug pure qual into a system where you're supposed to get feedback then? But yeah, like you said, the scale, I think that's a huge thing, very much so.
Can I ask one more clarifying question?
Sure.
And hopefully you're on that proposal Becky's talking about, but.
I emailed her about it and she's interested, so.
I digress. The interdisciplinary versus transdisciplinary versus multidisciplinary. So a lot of different disciplines use different terms.
Right.
And so what do you call when you have different academic disciplines who also engage with community as part of the research?
Yes, that's an excellent question. So I could share like a personal tidbit. So we wrote this paper and it's about anthropological approaches, right? And we say anthropology in the title, but one of the reviewers seemed to push back saying, well, you seem to be co-opting other disciplines. And so we said, no, what we're not saying that anthropologists own that. We're saying that anthropologists use that, because I think that is what you see in spaces like water insecurity. You have geographers, you have all these disciplines. So how do you still talk about them as broadly social science, but then yet honor the disciplinary differences within? Because I'm not, you know, swappable with a geographer necessarily. I could be maybe a health geographer, but economists are social scientists and we're clearly not the same. And so, yeah, I mean, that's something I struggle with, but I think that you can recognize that many disciplines use similar approaches, but that each discipline, we still have our own historical background, right? So I'm not interchangeable with a sociologist. I don't know the first thing about sociology, truly, but we're often allied. So yeah, I think, how do you talk about it? At least, I guess to me, it's talking less about a discipline and talking more about like the topic. So people who are like they study WASH, you know, and then they could represent all of these different disciplines. I don't know that answered your question.
Okay. Now, well, you'd use it, I think you used the term, but it was more in terms of disciplines working together. And so in some of our work, we talk about transdisciplinaries where you go outside of academic disciplines.
Oh, yes. Okay.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
But I've seen other papers now saying that, you know, it's not dealing with community transdisciplinary is what we would normally think of as interdisciplinary. So.
Yes, I see your point being, and I think that is important. yes, and I would definitely include non-academics within that definition for sure.
Okay.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
This is great.
Yeah, I know we're taking up a lot of your time beyond what we had asked. So feel free to, you can just shoo us away.
Oh no, this is great.
Saying, you know,
Yeah, so is there anyone else that has any questions? I haven't had any more come up in the chat or the Q&A. No, it doesn't look like it. Okay. Well, again, thank you so much from the bottom of our hearts. This was incredible. And let me just get to the right screen here. We all would like to thank you so much. So if you'd like to register for our future webinars, you may go to our website, www.strongcoast.org. It's listed under events and resources. We have at least 2 more coming up, one next week and then one on November 3rd. So again, thank you so much, Dr. Workman, and we hope you have a pleasant day. And thank you, everyone. I'm trying to wait.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone, for joining us.